Shepard, Anthony Giordano,
Present.
Gregory Faulkner,
Present.
Marjorie Dinstag, Alan Long,
Present.
and Alison Hirsch.
Thank you. Today we have a quorum. The first order of business is agenda item number 2, noting the minutes of the audit committee SPERS held on April 19th, 2023. The minutes have been previously provided to the committee via the SharePoint site and are also included in your packets. May I have a motion to consider the minutes from the April 19th committee meeting? So moved. Thank you, Tony. And second from Alan. Thank you so much. Please raise your hand if you approve the minutes. Any extensions? Motion carries. The next item on the agenda is agenda item number 3, the executive director's update. Sandy, have anything to share with us?
I'm going to reserve most of my comments for the board meeting tonight. I would just comment that a day for the first time in a number of years has authority to hire, and she's out there recruiting and hiring. If anyone knows anyone, a day, you know, I know you're getting close to bringing people in, which would be good for us. We abandon our third-party contract and go direct with staff, which are good luck with their hiring. I'm not directly involved, so I don't know the way it's going at the moment, but Dave, if you'd like to comment, I think that would be helpful.
Yes, well, it's been going, not as good as I expected, but I have a supervisor starting on October 2nd, and he's going to join me in finding the other 2 people. I'm excited to have him on board. He's very well experienced, credentialed as well, so I'm hoping for a smooth transition for him.
Call center role?
I'm sorry, what was it?
Call center role?
No, for internal audit.
Internal audit team, yeah.
Yeah.
Our hiring is going apace. There's a lot of activity.
Or an audit didn't have staff. It was all days on my in-house. Got it. Adding 3 in-house 13. Got it. Thank you.
The job notice. I mean, I know a lot of us have networks.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you.
That'd be very helpful.
Okay. Thank you, Sandy.
Here.
The next item on the agenda is item number 4, the internal audit director's update. Today,
Yes, thank you, John. All right, so as always today, I'll be presenting on the audits that were completed since the last audit committee meeting. I will update you on the audits that are currently ongoing, both internal and external. And then I'll close with an update on the status of prior audit findings. So that's the agenda for today. So the first audit we're covering today is the tax deferred annuity audit, TDA. Just to give a brief background. So TDA, the tax deferred annuity program, refers to voluntary contributions that eligible members are able to make to supplement their retirement. Now, the TDA is administered under Section 403B of the Internal Revenue Code, and the code also spells out the eligibility criteria for withdrawing funds from the TDA plan. This audit is focused, there are many aspects of the TDA, but this audit is focused on withdrawals from the TDA program. There are 4 main types of refunds. You have regular refunds, hardship withdrawals, required minimum distributions, and refund of deductions taken in error. So regular contributions are made to members who are eligible based on age or retirement. Hardship withdrawals are for members who are not eligible for a regular refund and are required to prove a financial hardship in order to take the monies out. And then required minimum distributions are for members or retirees who are 73 or 75, depending on their employment status. And a refund of deductions in error will just be anything that doesn't fall into that bucket or deductions that we have erroneously taken and have to pay back to the member. For the audit, our objectives were to assess controls around TDA refund processing. We wanted to determine their effectiveness, and we wanted to review for compliance with the rules that apply, such as the Internal Revenue Code and the BERS rules and regs. For our scope, we reviewed transactions that happened between December 2020 and December 2022. So it was a 2-year time span. And before I get into the findings, just to give you an overall viewpoint of what we found, we did conclude that the TDA team had effective controls around their processes as a whole. Just to highlight some of that, they have a 3-person review before every refund is distributed. And they also have a robust SOPM that covers all their processing and procedures. We did recommend an update to the SOPM in one of the findings, but as a whole, they are pretty equipped with their SOPMs. Are there any questions so far before I move into the findings?
I do. You mentioned the time period was 2020 to 2022, and I'm assuming COVID, right?
Yeah.
So I was a member, well, PDA from my education days, so I can imagine hardship and people retiring. So based on the process, was the 3 people enough to kind of handle that wave in regards to doing the audit?
So the 3-person reference I made wasn't to the number of staff in the department. They had, I believe they had around 8, if I'm not mistaken. I have that in the full report. But for each transaction, there's a 3-person review. So there's a preparer, a verifier, and then the supervisor approves.
Okay.
We monitor all backlogs across the agency. We've got a system that actually allows us to monitor this very closely. So yes, we never actually built up a significant backlog.
Okay.
All right, so going into the findings, the first one refers to the 1099 process and ownership of that process. So as part of our audit, we did a compliance review and reviewed applicable sections of the Internal Revenue Code against the TDA activities to determine compliance and effectiveness. As part of that review, one of the items that came up was the requirement that the includable gross income in the 1099 be accurate. So in our testing, we wanted to find out how BERS was making sure that those amounts are accurate. And what we found was that there was no clear ownership of whose responsibility it was to make sure that the 1099 was correct. We spoke to key stakeholders in the process, and each felt like it best belonged somewhere else. So we made the recommendation that BERS assign ownership, and also that BERS does a proactive spot check before the 1099s are issued, because once they are issued, they are in the hands of the member, and if there's any error, they may have already filed their taxes. There could be financial implications for the member. So from management's response, they agreed with the findings, and they did a review of the workflow, but ultimately they decided that it wasn't beneficial to add another control point as far as doing spot checks. So they are going to continue doing what they're already doing. However, if in the event of an error after the 1099s are issued, it's going to be a coordinated effort across departments to resolve whatever the issue is. Finding number 2 was regarding required minimum distributions and the application forms for those distributions. So like I said earlier, RMDs are required for members as early as age 73, depending on their employment status. Now, although the RMD form, application form is required, BERS is still able to process applications without a form simply because the Internal Revenue Service requires those distributions to happen. Now, in our sampling, we did a test of the application process, making sure that the controls were being effective on the forms, they were being properly completed and notarized and things like that. But in our review, we found that 1 out of 10 of our samples did not have an RMD form on file. The risk here is that there could be potential violation of New York City or New York State records retention rules. And so we recommended that BERS obtain original forms from the members and make sure that they're properly stored in the files. And for those cases where the forms are not received, we recommended that they make every effort to obtain those forms and document those efforts on file for the members. So management agreed with our findings and recommendations, and they will be establishing a process that will start in December, where they will lean on MCU. MCU is our member communications unit to help them in contacting these members and trying to obtain the forms for these members. Yes.
This process is performed sometimes because it's required by the government, you have to do it, been done. Sometimes push back, well, required, why have to apply for it? So it's challenging on the mission.
All right, so finding number 3 came out of our eligibility review. Like I mentioned, we were looking at the forms, making sure the address used match the form, the EFT accounts match what the member asked for, and things like that. So in that review, we noted that the address in CPMS for a member did not match what was on the application. Now, during the audit, the TDA form had a checkbox where if you wanted your permanent address in our records to be updated, you would check off that box, and based on that, your address will be updated. So we found a member who had checked off the box, but their address wasn't updated. So our recommendation here was to, as part of their routine processing, include a check for the address. We also recommend that post-processing, they pull random samples and just review them to make sure that they were processed accurately. Management agreed with the finding, but they did disagree on the use of the TDA form as a means of updating address. So what they did was work with member communications to have that checkbox completely removed from the form. So that checkbox has now been removed, and I guess the issue won't be happening going forward. Finding number 4 was regarding application processing timelines. So on BERS's website, the published timeline for applications is 60 days for hardship withdrawals and 60 to 90 days, bless you, for regular withdrawals. So this is the expectation of the member that when they file for those kinds of refunds, they will receive their checks within that timeline. So in 5 of our samples, we noted that the applications were processed outside of the timeline. In fairness, sometimes it's out of the control of the refunds unit. Sometimes they're waiting on information from the member and things like that. So for our recommendation here, we recommended that they generate a weekly aging report that will let the supervisor know what applications are pending, what stage in the process they're in, and who's responsible. And then we also recommended that if possible, CPMS be equipped with push notifications. That way they get an alert when an application is moving through the system and it's aging. So, and then we also recommended that they update the SOPM because those time guidelines published on the website are not on the SOPM. So we want to make sure that the expectations of the members align with what the staff are working under. So management agreed, and they have established a weekly report that they provide to each unit to monitor the status of refund applications in the system. Are there any questions before I get to the last one? Okay, so the last finding for this audit had to do with the application variant that the member requested versus what they actually got. So we were reviewing the forms to make sure that the member's withdrawal was processed as instructed by the member. And in our review, we found 2 cases where the member had requested a hardship withdrawal and received a regular refund. Now, this mattered because there are 2 separate requirements for hardship versus regular refunds. So we wanted to make sure that there's no confusion between both, especially when determining eligibility for the refund type, because there are tax consequences there. So what we recommended was that when there is a change in the variant being processed from what the member requested on form, there has to be communications with the member. First of all, the member has to request a change, and we have to document the change so that there's a complete chain of events on what happened. So management agreed with that also, and going forward, they plan to note any such changes on the account.
Is there any educational advice given to the member in terms of situation, long-term tax benefits, long-term benefits?
Generally, we don't give tax advice, but I believe if they're sitting with a counselor at the time that they apply, there will be some discussion. If the member has a question, they'll answer it to the best that they can. But we try to stay away from giving them binding tax advice. Are there any questions on this audit before I move on to the next one?
Quick question. So overall, how do you monitor the progress? Because I know some solution that has been brought up and suggested to management, but if you have like a benchmark where you're starting from, in other words, like the form, 60% of the members don't have forms, and the goal is to have 10% every year increase. So this way progress can be tracked. Otherwise, it's just going to go nowhere the way I look at it.
Yeah, so from audit perspective, we keep track of all the findings and all the recommendations. And I think in another 2 years or 3 years, there'll be a repeat audit of this area. So we will assess where they are at that point versus where they are now. Now, as far as benchmarks, that will be something that the department will have to set for themselves. And then we can measure against that when we do the audits. But I don't think that they have that at this time. But if that's something that, you all are interested in, I could also communicate that to them.
I would like to see a personally to see progress. There is a report that I believe is standing out of audit foundation on file, and where it can fix or improve, we might have to the part to. But do you want itself?
With due dates.
Yes.
And one last thing on withdrawals from accounts. Secure 2.0, which is allowing us to Rothify accounts, also provides significant changes in the laws around withdrawals from accounts related to medical emergencies, et cetera. You'll be hearing a little bit about that today from Alex Gonzalez. These weren't items that we prioritized in our systems improvements, but we're scheduling them out so that we can offer all those provisions to our members. They're not required provisions, but these are advantageous to members to be adopted.
This is all one system, right? Or it's multiple, like.
This is one system. It's processed in CPMS.
The labor applications,
We are going to be ready in January.
oh, really?
Yep, we're done. We're going to be done. I think they're probably 2/3 through that work now.
But it's only delayed, I think. The
The requirement, the mandatory requirement's been delayed by 24 months. 24 months. Yeah, and but we will have it available to members. Hopefully by January end. I would say no later than February end, based on the updates.
My question is, to Tony's point, why not educate them around the choices they're making in the tax implications? That just beyond the scope of what you do, or is it just a third-party relationship if you did a withdrawal or,
Yeah, it's the liability, and I would argue that we don't, our counselors are not trained up to do that, and we don't have access to the detailed information about how they will make that decision. So we've talked a little bit about this, about the ratification from our systems, right? The ratification for our system, we will very definitely share information with our members who participate in DDA about why this might be attractive for them.
Mhm.
Because you pay taxes today and never pay taxes on accumulating balances in your Roth. But that's about as far as we can go legally. It's up to them to understand the math in their own terms and talk to their tax advisors to see if it actually makes sense for them. It's hard to argue it wouldn't make sense. And we'd probably be safe to say you really should do this, but we can't.
And you can't refer to a third party, like you mentioned, if they were at their counselor at the time, then they would benefit from having that insight and expertise. So is it just a recommendation too? So that way, is that just a solution to make sure that they know they should probably get some level of education before they make some?
put up the notices yet, but I can assure you that will probably be the first thing it says and the last thing it says.
No, I was gonna say, from the union's perspective, what we normally do is advise the interest to our pension unit first. Get advice before they sit with a counselor and move towards retirement. We actually do that in the system and not all of them take advantage of it. So,
And then what is the impact if like, I'm just thinking post-COVID, after COVID, like I could see a lot of people doing hardship withdrawals, like if there's some implication to BERS, if like there is an exorbitant amount of people that now take advantage of one withdrawal over the other, right? Like it's then decreasing the funds you have to invest and so forth, like if they're not making wise decisions and just making decisions on, current circumstances. I'm just trying to figure out how both parties would benefit from people on decision necessarily.
So they will provide general tax information. But like Sandy said, because we don't have that complete 360 view of the members' standpoint from a tax perspective, we're not able to give them specific tax advice.
And the union will.
It sounds like they are able to do more than.
we have a, pension, DC-37 as a whole. Yeah. Was several system, pension system. So we get some form of advice. I don't know if they go into the technical sense of what you're asking, Michelle, where they're advising them what to do. I'm not sure how deep they go. Each department in DC-37 is also open up. They do in their area and I don't work here, so I can't like tell you exactly. But what they do, I do know that they advise them prior to the coming to the retirement system.
Now, just for clarity, would it be advisement or would it be education? Because in all honesty, right? A lot of people don't want to advise because you don't want to lie about you for, hey, but you told me this. Well, we're advising you, but no, you told me this, so I did it and I lost a lot of money. But education basically is that it's good for you to invest. This is how we work. If you are hardship and you need to take out this money, there will be penalty because you're not fully matured and et cetera, or you could borrow against it if you need it, like our 401k, right? We could borrow, that's the right section. Yeah, exactly. So if that is, then a little bit more education.
DC-37 does have the, does have a, pension committee. So, on that, pension. It's not something that we do, maybe.
And then the support line, if there is one, for them to call, like members. At the end of the day, is when people start, even when I started when I was young, I already didn't much start retirement, but I was young, right? Come up with some money to buy. But then later on, you start thinking about it, when I needed something, someone told me, hey, you could borrow, if you, so, contribute into this, it's good for retirement, but then also if you need something, you can always borrow, et cetera. Now they're like, the light bulb goes on and, okay, I want to find out more. The helpline, I call the helpline, and then they educate them exactly what their options are. And then it's up to them to whether they want to go and sign up for it and continue on. Some of that as well, how they for that exact from CDA. And loan hardship. So,
Alan, the way I do it with my union members is I'll never make a decision for them. I'll say, these are your options and whatever works best for you. If you do this, this may happen. Will you do that? You may get that thing.
Yeah.
And I let them make the call. I will never sit there and say, you need to do this. Because if you do that and it's wrong, then they come back to me. So I like to present options. These are your options and whatever works best for you. And that's the way I do it.
And I think it goes back to just, is there an opportunity to educate the folks? And it may be multiple voices, so it's here, right? So I hear BERS and talk to your council,
that comes back first.
right, yeah, okay. And then, I hear the union saying, come in for a session. So they're getting multiple layers. And since this touches multiple agencies or multiple, is there a way to kind of have efficiency, because it's one education, right? That touches different people, because the tax laws and changing, and, so it could be a way to have an efficient way to educate. Like, I started teaching at 20. I didn't know I couldn't care less about retirement, but I know I was at the TDA, and someone mentioned it to me, but I didn't really put that much energy on it at the time. But I was all for education, right? So, but nobody presented it to me in a way where it was like, get educated on this. It's like, if you need it, it's there, pay into it. And that was the end of the conversation. I mean, that was my experience.
Taken from my experience is that every year during open enrollment, my company would have all this in, accessible resource, or even a Zoom call, right? Something that basically join up to hear more about contributions to retirement, join up to hear more about the new features we have with this new insurance company and this one, so you could choose properly. So it could be done open enrollment or every year that education comes out for everyone.
Yeah, I think automatic enrollment, retirement system is going to be key. It's going to be aligned with the retirement system. So I would push, but I think I've said this in every meeting, that all of us have an effort into pushing sign this bill. The bill has passed both houses, right? But once again, pushing that auto enrollment is going to change a lot.
Advise, somebody puts an application, do we advise them that the option is consulting union? Or is that something, in other words, people may not know where to go to get that kind of advice. Do we actually have something that kind of suggests that they might want to have, that it's an option available to them?
Our MTU organization coordinates with all the unions, actually with outreach. So I can't say that they.
But if I submit an application and I'm going to do something with my funds, say you should talk to a financial advisor, that might be daunting. But does it say one of your options might be to reach out to pension unit at DC 37 with their members and have that go? So it's just a little voice to tell them to go.
I don't believe we've ever recommended that our members reach out to DC 37 and leave that to them, but we always provide access to our council, but on a need to basis.
Yeah, and what we do at the union meeting, we don't have the representatives from BERS. Yeah, if we do district meetings that are in the areas, we try to get a representative to work with BERS folks to answer those questions. I have the same, I let the expert be the expert. Right? So if you ask me a question, they say, well, aren't you a trustee? I say, well, we deal with this, but your question that you're asking, the councils deal with that every day, right? So they're the experts, but we try to coordinate with them and our meetings.
Is there an opportunity to be kind of proactive? Like, for instance, at the end of this week, student loans are due. So I can anticipate a bunch of people who now have to start paying student loans, paraprofessionals, and so forth, are gonna start feeling the crunch, their light bill went up. Here's this. And is that a hardship opportunity? Like, if they're proactive means when we see something happening in the space that impacts our members, that we can educate them, or so if it's not all the time, can we be intentional with it?
Try to be hardship withdrawals is very highly regulated under the law. So unfortunately, just needing the money isn't sufficient for a hardship. They have to testify to a medical bill or
Well, it's still part.
Yeah.
Well, it's off as well, so.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on. All right, so the next audit today is our audit of travel and conference expenses at BERS. So our objectives for this one was to assess compliance with policies and rules and regs that apply. And we also wanted to determine whether transactions were appropriate, properly approved and processed, and supported by required documentation. So for this audit, our criteria were developed based on the New York City Controller's Directive 6. Now, Directive 6 prescribes the requirements for incurring travel-related expenses, approving and processing reimbursement for those expenses, as well as the procedures to ensure that those expenses are necessary and appropriate. As far as the scope, the expenses we reviewed included reimbursements for long-distance travel, lodging, and meals, and the reimbursements for those between July 2018 and December 2022. From an overall standpoint, Fiscal Ops has strong controls around their processes. And part of that would be the multiple levels of review that they do before approving reimbursements. And they also have implemented a new improved reimbursement form that allows for itemization and other support to be provided. If there are any questions about this process, I'll be happy to answer them before going into the findings.
I just had a comment on seek reimbursement one time, and it took me a while to get it. So yes, the internal control. So I sent the document, same document 5-6 times.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was thorough.
Yes, they really take their time. Yeah.
Yes.
But they also are, trying to improve on the timeliness of that as well. All right, so finding number 1 has to do with the absence of documented policies and procedures. Now, Directive 6 does state that agencies should establish and regularly review policies so as to limit expenditure and make sure that there's appropriate management of the budget as it relates to travel and those kinds of expenses. And also having a policy will help to ensure that there's compliance. It will guide decision making and also inform employees of what expenses are allowable. We also noted that the findings around this audit kind of had a common theme, and it was because they didn't have documented policies. So there was the tendency to pay on expenses that were incurred because they were already incurred, and there wasn't a policy to begin with saying you can't, we can't pay for stuff like that. So we'll see that as we go through the findings. So our first recommendation was that BERS complete and implement a travel policy. There's currently one in draft, and the completion of that was kind of delayed by staff turnover. So there's a new person who's responsible for this function and is actively working to update the draft. We also recommended that BERS considers using a software platform to help streamline the process, and also that it will ensure that the required documentation is submitted. So management's response was that they are currently drafting the policy and they are speaking with IT to kind of work out what sort of online platform that they can implement to help move the process along. Finding number 2 has to do with disallowed expenses being reimbursed. And these were certain expenses for travel insurance, airfare rate, and conference lodging. So for travel insurance, Directive 6 does not allow reimbursement for travel insurance. Doesn't allow reimbursement for seat upgrades, though there's limited exception to that, and also doesn't allow airfare to Albany or Washington, D.C., with exception as well. So for lodging, conference rate lodging is only allowed up to 150% of GSA rate. So during our testing, we noted 3 flights to DC were reimbursed, a seat upgrade was reimbursed, and 4 instances of flight insurance was reimbursed. And then we also noted 8 reimbursements for conference site lodging that was higher than the Directive 6 max. And there were no supporting documents to explain or justify why these disallowed expenses were approved or reimbursed. So management responded that for our recommendation here. So we recommended that BERS implement a pre-approval for travel. and that the pre-approval should include a description of the need for travel, itemize the expenses and approvals. That way, when an employee submits their pre-approval to travel, the expenses are clearly outlined and the approver is able to itemize and approve each item. And it makes it easier for them to spot expenses that are not allowed. So for management's response, they did say that they have implemented itemized expenses as of January, but they don't have itemized approvals yet. So that will be part of their upgrade to the form. And then they also wanted to point out that exceptions to Directive 6 were verified on a case-by-case basis, and that those reimbursements were approved by the manager and the executive office before they were paid. Their action plan is to develop a formal pre-approval form so that expenses are reviewed for allowability prior to being incurred. Finding number 3 has to do with issues with long distance travel pre-approvals. So when you look at Directive 6, when Directive 6 references approvals, their definition of approval is wherever possible or practicable, the expenses should be approved before they're incurred. So pre-approvals is synonymous with approval. For long distance travel, Directive 6 is requiring that there's a written request that describes how the travel provides a specific educational or other benefit that cannot be gained in another manner or locally. In our testing, we noted that there was no documentation available where employees were justifying why they needed to take a long distance trip, or that they had done a search to find the same or similar subject matter locally. So we recommended that all pre-approvals be done in writing and that be accompanied with written justification for long distance conferences. And management responded that they are now requiring written approval, and that as part of the upgrade to their form and their policy, they will also require pre-approval. Did you have a question? No? Okay. Finding number 4 has to do with issues with excessive long distance travel. So Directive 6 allows only 2 discretionary long distance conferences in a fiscal year. And the exception to that will be what they call non-discretionary or essential conferences. Bless you. So in our review, we looked at long distance travel for FY 19, 20, and 22. We skipped 2021 because COVID was raging and people were not able to travel. So in our review, we noted that there was excessive long distance travel, and we recorded up to 19 trips over the 2-trip limit per fiscal year. And there was no documented justification for why those trips were necessary. For our recommendation, we recommended that BERS update its travel policy to clearly define what constitutes discretionary and non-discretionary conferences as it relates to the processes at BERS. And then we also pointed out to them that Directive 6 cautions against inappropriate classification of discretionary versus non-discretionary to kind of circumvent the restriction. So we also recommended that they conduct a periodic review on the number of trips, long distance trips, and report that to the executive office. The response from management was that these travel requests are usually approved by the executive office and that they provide an annual update to the executive office on trips taken. So their action plan is going to include pre-approval and written justification for long distance travel. And that will also be included in the policy that's currently being drafted. And then last of the findings here would be issues with post-conference attendance reporting. So Directive 6 requires employees to submit a brief synopsis of the relevant subject matter covered at the conference within 14 days of the employee's return. Now, in our testing, 92% of our samples did not submit the required post-conference attendance reporting. This is also one of the things that came out of not having a policy, because we didn't have a policy saying this is required. So a couple of employees will submit just based on their free will, I guess, but the majority of employees did not submit this report. So we recommended that this report be required as part of the approval process before before reimbursements are made. And also having a recording of what was learned might be beneficial to the agency as far as knowledge transfer and making sure that the content of a conference is relevant to BERS work. So management's response is that their new reimbursement form now incorporates the required report as a requirement, and that they are not processing any reimbursements. That's it for the audit. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to. Okay, so next here would be an update on the calendar year activities within internal audit. So we are currently working on payroll procedures. We are in the reporting phase on that audit. It's an audit that we do every year based on the Controller's Directive 13. We are also in field work for the QPP refunds audit, as well as the member self-service MSS. We're doing a cybersecurity audit of that as well. And then we have dormant accounts audits scheduled to a couple of months. We'll be kicking that off. And then we have recently kicked off the participant account adjustments audit. As far as external audits and reviews, we have the annual audit of our financial statements by Grant Thornton. They usually will report to the board on their audit in December, so the full board will get a report on that. We're also under audit by the controller. They're looking at the New York City controller. So they're looking at our financial and operating practices and board governance. And then we have an audit that we're pretty much waiting on the report for this one. So it's the New York State Department of Financial Services. They were here in 2020 reviewing everything for the last 5 years. And so we're waiting to hear back on that. And then there's one that's not listed here. I apologize for that. It's Milliman's administrative review of BERS, and they're currently doing that on behalf of the controller.
Question in regards to the payroll procedure audit. There's a lot of talk around underrepresentation in certain industries. I think the finance industry definitely has been flat. So when you guys do, for instance, the payroll audit with a focus on processes around wage establishment and adjustment, how does the insight from the audit impact what the industry is showing around underrepresentation? Like, did one inform the other?
Well, so as far as the wages, there are requirements. DCAS establishes the salary ranges. So we're not able to, we can only operate within those ranges. So as far as impact, with wages on the outside, we really are not able to do much. What they're able to do is maybe if an employee is overperforming and getting more responsibility, they can move them up a level, and that way they're able to compensate them more. But they're not able to exceed what those set ranges are.
Okay, so there's parameters with what the person can get, but who's getting it is what's being brought to the attention. So there's an underrepresentation of BIPOC populations, especially in finance, which is this space.
This is the payroll from the city of New York.
This is across the city, or is it
No,
just
Our members, our payroll coming in.
Oh, okay,
Yes, sir.
so it's for the members of BERS.
It's what yearly reports to BERS,
Okay.
which members have made contributions, loan paybacks,
Mhm.
all that payroll data comes to go into our system.
Okay, but you do have demographic data on top of what you're getting.
Of our membership?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you then have a bird's eye view of what the city is doing in regards to wage establishment and adjustments.
Right, but that would not be within the purview of BERS, that would be the FOIA itself, of
Okay,
the way we don't establish that here.
If I'm not mistaken. Or off the list, right, civil services, like, except for the supervisor, right, there's a high percentage of members that are funded with the market, right?
Yes, yes.
right.
So
If they're on the list, right, so.
that's something purview of BERS, separated.
Okay,
We internally, do EO report annually.
mhm,
We share that information with the board. And we do a survey every 2 or 3 years of internal compensation, looking for, discrepancies, not in equity, but discrepancies. And just in the last 3 months, we put a floor under all deputy director positions in terms of compensation as a result of discrepancies that have built up over time. So there is an internal unofficial process of reviewing that information.
right.
with
Our
the-
job, BERS employees.
Yeah,
For BERS.
for our employees.
But not across your membership.
No, we can't reach to them. I mean, we can report on what we know, but we can't reach.
So-
Is right on BERS, it's 70% female membership, 7% BIPOC.
And for clarification, so what was in scope for us here was BERS employees and how their wages are processed and the controls around that.
Right,
So we wanted to make sure that they have the right approvals for like increases or for placing them on payroll and things like that.
so, okay,
So it was much a narrower scope than what's being discussed.
What's, your office is one.
Well, not for much longer, but
Soon to be an office of 3, 4.
I mostly serve as a liaison. So when the annual audit of our financial statements is happening, that's very heavily focused on the financial. So they deal directly with fiscal ops. And I sit in on those meetings and I will speak on the IT aspect. So I'm a little bit more involved with the IT aspect of that audit. But in general, I will liaise between any external parties.
And departments that move.
Our director of fiscal ops. And actually, we delivered to the controller the final closings on our books 2 weeks ago. Right on
No,
time,
probably,
first
yeah.
year. First year ever, right on time. And we finalized the comments to Grant Thornton just last week. So it's kind of in there.
So moving on, I will just give a quick update on the status of prior audit findings. So if we start with the chart on the top right, that is showing you findings that have been remediated since the last audit committee meeting, which was in April. Since then, 6 findings were fully remediated and 40 are either in process or not started. The next slide will cover that in more detail. And then the chart on the bottom shows the remediation status from an overall standpoint. Around 54% of the high-risk findings are remediated, while 46% are open. And then if you look at the medium risk items, around 59 are fully remediated and 41% are in progress. Now, just a little bit of high-level detail. When it comes to outstanding findings, one of what we had was regarding shadow IT practices. That's a practice we noted from our information security audit where departments are able to procure, implement, and deploy software with little or no involvement from IT or approvals from IT, and that is quite high risk. So we recommended that they implement a policy prohibiting that, and that at a minimum, IT approval be required for all software purchases. So IT has updated their policy to make that clear that there can be no software purchases without their involvement or approval. So that's completed. And then as far as the call center, what we noted was that there was a high rate of lost calls. And some of what was contributing to that was staffing and some of their reference guides and documentation. So they're fully staffed. I believe they got maybe 1 or 2 headcount. Oh, they got 8. Awesome. In the last budget. Okay, so prior to that, okay. Prior to that, they were fully staffed. And so we marked this one as completed. They updated all their knowledge documents and reference guides. And that really helps them as far as providing uniform training for everyone of the new staff. Defaulted loans processing was another one. There was a cleanup project that has now been completed. And now they're just in maintenance mode and they have ongoing reviews and cleanup as issues are coming up. And then, like I said earlier, the TDA form was updated to prevent use for address change. Any questions on this slide?
Just a top bullet point in regards to installation of software. So right now, your laptop and your desktops are not locked down where you cannot load any software unless it's really considered, blessed.
So the desktops are, the laptops, I believe there's some software you're able to install. But the workaround for that is a lot of these things are SaaS, right? Software as a service. So you don't necessarily have to download anything to your computer. So, they're able to procure, sign a contract, get a software and get to work.
And this is where IT will need to actually strengthen up the firewall to make sure certain domains cannot go out or lock down totally.
Well, that's a separate question, Alan. We have multiple layers of protection. First, we operate within the DOE infrastructure.
Okay.
And then within the DOE infrastructure, we operate our own remote desktop software as a service delivery to external computers, which is secure. You can't download, you can't upload, you can't print, you can't. So that system actually protects CPMS within the DOE umbrella. And there are, we deal with our interaction with DOE often on a contentious basis because on occasion they will be more restricted than we will be, but they have.
So the SaaS application that you guys will be accessing really or database or something that's
Correct. And our database.
Hey,
and
this is good for you. Why don't you do this?
Right. And CPMS is hosted on AWS. We went to AWS from our own servers as a savings, cybersecurity protection, and just more efficiency. And the provider, Vitech, is complete. They are completely on AWS, so we're protected in that.
And to add to that, IT has also started the process of gaining admin access and visibility into these systems that we were talking about. They've had meetings, or they had a meeting with one of the vendors for one of the software to kind of understand the back end of their system and how they can gain access, what kind of access they'll need. So they are proactively working to rein in that sort of practice.
Right. See some of these things.
And came from an AI conversation, and I hear a lot of conversations here about hiring for like call centers and so forth. So how are, I guess, BERS thinking about labor costs, bringing on these people, the efficiencies? Because I mean, out of one of the reports, it was like 49 or 53 didn't submit something. So the people who are oversight, might be overwhelmed. There may be reasons why certain things aren't actually being done. So how are you guys looking at that whole space and addressing some of these inefficiencies or gaps or, whatever is causing the highs?
ChatGPT cannot be.
One of the problems with large language, models is that it's public information once you use it. So
Well, we learned that
don't allow it.
we have
We can actually,
proprietary,
we
yeah.
can have proprietary. We're not prepared to pay for that yet, although we're experimenting with one system in investment strategy. Just to test it out. So call center is an excellent example of how BERS has changed over the years. 6 years ago, there was no call center. We relied on the DOE call center members. We were lucky to get anyone who knew what was going on. They would transfer calls into ops. They wouldn't get answered. The phone would ring. We established a call center. We established it small. It was overwhelmed because we just weren't big enough. BERS has gone from 65 to 165 staff in the last 7 years. 86, whatever that number is, right? So there's been a lot of change. In terms of the call center, we're now stabilizing around the level of staff, which on a model basis, looking back 3 or 4 years, predicted the required staff. These models are actually common. They predict the amount of staff we need. We're actually in the middle of an RFP to reconfigure our current call center system, which is a software as a service provided voice over IP system, which actually for the whole agency, but targets call center. That RFP, among the things it asks, is for direct integration to our data systems and provision of not artificial intelligence, but managed answering capabilities through FAQs, right? So we have our own FAQs, and it would be great to automate them. You just can't. It's something that would be provided by that call center software system. And, I haven't seen an update on that. Have you seen an update on that? Yeah, they must not have selected anyone yet. So as soon as IT and MCU selects one, we'll probably get a briefing on what it is they're doing. But that's Sally Rivera and Steve Sibilli. Those are the respective directors of MCU and IT. They are the leads on that. And we are improving our call center on a daily basis. And it's come up from effectively nothing 4 years ago, 5 years ago, 5 years ago.
So moving on to chart number 3, this shows you the distribution of those 40 findings I referenced in the last slide. So what we kind of did was identify 7 main operational areas and group the findings where we felt it was more appropriate. So we have benefits, compliance, customer service, facilities, fiscal ops, HR, and information technology. Self-explanatory. So from the chart, you can see about a third of the open high-risk findings are in the areas of compliance and information technology. So things like defaulted loans processing, SCP arrears, and things like that will fall under that. For the moderate or medium risk findings, around 38% are within fiscal ops and IT. Example of what's included there would be treatment of interest, change management, and findings from prior audits. The last slide will go into more detail on the status and action taken so far. But just to give a high-level brief update on these. So from our variable funds takedown audit, we had noted that there wasn't a contract between BERS and TRS, and this contract is required by education law and the BERS rules and regs. So we had recommended that a contract be developed, so that's still working. The security of physical access to the data centers is underway. Actually, I have an update on that today, that they have an SOW with an organization that's going to provide security to the data centers here at 55 Water. Financial reporting process, the reports are still being generated manually. It was the hope that this fiscal year cycle, they could have had automated reports all the way, but that's kind of falling back a little bit. Outstanding checks, there's also a big update here. Now there's a tool on our website where beneficiaries or individuals are able to search to see if they have any checks outstanding with BERS. That was a recommendation that was that has been partly implemented.
Do we pay digitally? Like if a member is supposed to get a check, can you just sell it to me or wire it to me? Like, is it still a paper check?
Paper check or EFT? I don't think we're doing sales.
We've talked about that often, and we just can't force them to take an EFT. Many of our checks go internationally, and so, and people, I mean, some of our Tyra, you can't tell if they even have accounts.
Yeah, so procurement has been delayed because there was staff turnover, and now there's a new director in that area that's working to set things up. SCP and arrears cash account cleanup is now starting. They were waiting to finish up with the loans cleanup first and then prioritize SCP. Account management is being worked on by IT. They need to secure a web-based tool for privileged access management. Offsite backup, I believe they're still in discussions to move to a New Jersey location. And then lastly, velocity post-implementation review is still pending. If there are any questions, I'll take them. All right, so moving on to the last slide and last chart. So this shows overall remediation progress of the high and medium rated risk across all departments. Looking at the high risk finding, just over half have been fully remediated and around 9% is yet to be remediated. And almost about a quarter are currently in progress. And what that means is that remedial action has started or parts of the action plan has been implemented while others are still pending. And then for the medium risk findings, nearly 60% are complete, about a third are in progress, while 9% are pending corrective action. So for the contract I referred to in the prior slide for variable annuity fund, the target date for that is December 23rd. I believe that's going to be somewhat impacted by the departure of the investment director as well. So
I don't want to put it off.
yeah.
That's okay.
So for outstanding checks, that upload is now complete to the website. Procurement is on hold, as I said. Now there's a new director and I know she's working on stuff. Key financial reports, the hope is to have those testing by this month. Data centers is currently, like I said, being procured, and I got that update today about a vendor being secured. Offsite backup, I don't have an updated timeline for that, but they are drafting a backup policy and are speaking with vendors. And then for the PAM tool, September is the target date for that. And the tool will be deployed in March based on the last update. Are there any questions on this one? And that is everything for today.
Thank you, Ade.
Thank you.
If anybody would like to have a discussion, I'm gonna need a motion. If not, I'm gonna move to concluding the meeting. Anybody have anything to discuss? Okay, that concludes the agenda for this meeting. The next meeting for the Audit Committee of BERS will be scheduled for the first quarter of 2024 and communicated to all committee members and invitees. Can I have a motion to adjourn? Thank you. And a second? Second. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries. Thank you, everyone.